5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We are here with another episode of Address It. I am here with Sonya Emerick. Sonya Emerick is running for school board at large,
Yeah.
right? Right.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Can you tell us about that? What is that? What is that? School board at large.
Yeah. So with our school board in Minneapolis, 3 of the seats out of the 9 total are at-large seats. So those are people who represent the entire city instead of like just one part of the city. So the other 6 have their districts that they represent spread out across the city, and then at-large candidates represent the entire city. And that's what I'm running for.
So it's kind of like running for mayor almost. Then, like as far as like a big covering.
Kinda, yeah. I mean, mayor of the school system almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What's the process though? I mean, because not everybody made it to where you're at, right?
That's right. So, first you have to file to run, and that was back in May. You have to go to like city voter services. For school board, you go to city voter services. And then, depending on how many candidates file to run in a particular race, if there's a lot of them, they get narrowed down in a primary election. So our primary was in the beginning of August, and we went from 6 candidates in my race, the at-large race, down to 4. So the 4 folks who got the most votes went on, and that's for 2 seats that are available. So everyone in Minneapolis can vote for at-large school board candidates. Anywhere in Minneapolis, you can vote in this race. It'll be on your ballot. And then the top 2 vote getters from the 4 of us are who will end up elected and sitting on the school board.
Okay, Sonya, I want to know about you though. I want to know, where you from, who, what, where, when. I got to get in your business a little bit. Tell me,
Yeah, I lived in Minneapolis my whole life. So I am from the South Side and grew up there. I went to Minneapolis public schools all 12 years, graduated South High School 2000. And then about 10 years ago, I moved to the North Side and lived over like by North Commons and the North Side Y, over there right off West Broadway, and lived there for about 8 years. And then we moved downtown to, in 2019, we were blessed to get a Section 8 housing choice voucher. And so that obviously is a life-changing situation, and we were able to move down to new construction close to Loring Park downtown, where there's a HUD building down there that takes Section 8. And so that's where we've been. So I've lived all over the city, and I have 2 kids. I have an 18-year-old and I have a 7-year-old. And I have been a community organizer in Minneapolis since I was a teenager, and that's what I love to do. And my 7-year-old has complex disabilities and has been receiving special education through Minneapolis public schools since he was 2. And every year it gets harder to get equitable access to his services that he deserves and he needs and his education. And finally it got to the point where I was fighting so hard and going to so many meetings and doing so much advocacy that I thought, if I'm going to be working this hard on behalf of education equity, let's not just have it be for my one child, right? Let's have it be for all the kids in Minneapolis. And so I'm not a politician. It's a year ago, I never would have thought of running for office at all. I'm just a parent. But I'm trying to like grow where I'm planted, right? And if this is where I can affect change and do good, then I just want to take that opportunity,
So, I mean, I know it was like an initial moment though, like a decision moment where you was like, man, I'm running. I'm running now. I need, things are not going well, or things are not going as well as can be.
Mhm.
Can you tell me about that moment when you made the decision?
Yeah, well, it was really, all right, so like when you think of people running, campaigning for public office, like getting elected, you think of a certain type of person. I mean, I do. I think of a type of person that has a background that's not my background. Like I don't come from a background where this is like something that it felt like it would be obvious that I would do. And I didn't really have the confidence to feel like this is something that's for me. This is something, an opportunity that is for me. And it was really honestly community members who came to me and said, you should really consider doing this. You would be the right person. And eventually, you know, somebody just had a conversation with me and said, please run. We need you. Whatever I need to do to support you so that you feel like you can do this, please let me know, because like you're needed. And that feels really good. Like it feels really good when your community is like, if you are willing to step up, let us support you to do this because you have something that's needed. And I hadn't really had an opportunity like that in my life before. I don't have a college degree. I don't have a career, right? Like I've worked little jobs and I've parented and just been trying to survive, and to feel like I could actually do something and that people believed in me, like I had to step into that. And that was that moment. It was other people saying, we believe in you. And then I had to come to believe in myself that I could do it.
So what do you think make you different, or did they tell you what do they see that makes you different than people that's on the board now?
Yeah, well, I'm disabled myself, so I have been identified as disabled by the state of Minnesota, and I receive disability services. And then I have a child who is disabled and receives special education services, and I feel like it is an aspect of diversity that's not currently represented or has not historically been represented. And about 20% of kids in Minneapolis public schools receive some form of special education services. And there's a particular insight that adults with disabilities can bring to special education services that people aren't talking about. It's not being addressed. These services are not equitable. They're not, like they're being used to harm some children, right? In some cases, they're just not being delivered. In some cases, they're being weaponized, right? We see incredible, horrific disparities in terms of how special education addresses the needs of white children and how special education addresses or doesn't address the needs of black children, indigenous children, and children of color in schools. So I think that lens and that how I prioritize untangling the multiple issues to do with special education is really important to me. I also think so there's this form of oppression called ableism, right? And I think it's really connected to racism. And I think that they have to be dismantled together because they feed each other and they interact with each other. And that is work that I've spent many, many years of my life learning about from Black disabled scholars, for instance, who are brilliant. And I want to bring that thread through because I feel like it's really needed in order for us to have real equity in our school system.
So is that the biggest focus, special education?
Well, I think equity would be my biggest focus. So that means for me, that means addressing the needs and concerns of all the students who have historically not been well served or who have been disenfranchised. So I primarily think of students who receive special education services, BIPOC students, students who are homeless and highly mobile, students who have a non-English home language or who are multilingual learners. I think those are particular groups of students who need to have their needs better addressed.
All right. So the teacher strike,
Yeah.
you know, you was able to observe that from the outside.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about some of your thoughts regarding that? Did it come to a good agreement in your eyes, or how did that go?
I mean, I think that there were some really important gains, some really important victories. So I think most folks feel like the protections for educators of color are one of the largest victories that came out of the strike, which I 100% agree with.
What was that?
So that provides some protections for educators of color, and the actual contract wording has to do with representation and mirroring our students, but it essentially means that if there is a point where educators have to be accessed or laid off, so removed from their positions or removed from employment because we're overstaffed, right? That in some cases, educators of color will have some protections. The reason that's important is there's been an effort to racially diversify our teaching force in Minneapolis, which is really needed, but because the way that hiring and firing works is that, you know, the last person hired is going to be the first person fired.
Right.
It means that we kind of have this churn of new educators of color that come in and then get laid off because they're the newest, and we can't retain enough educators of color to really you know, accomplish the goals that we're trying to with diversifying the workforce in education in Minneapolis public schools. So that was really, really important. And then the other really important victory was that ESPs got some really good pay increases. Those are education support professionals like teachers' aides or paraprofessionals or special education assistants kind of fall under that umbrella. Different people call them different things, but those workers had, you know, really were not making a living wage, and they're closer now. So, but I do think that there's a lot of the demands that couldn't be met in the last negotiation that are meritorious that still need to be addressed moving forward. And you know, what we need to do is get the Minnesota legislature to fund and invest in education so that we can survive as a district and pay teachers what they're worth and create the working conditions and the learning conditions that our district needs and deserves.
Why do you think it's so tough to come to like a number that teachers, like a salary number, a living salary for teachers, considering all that they do?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to speak on specifics because obviously I haven't been a part of the contract negotiations, and I know that different educators make different amounts of money, and there's a lot going into what any individual educator would make. But I mean, as far overall as like why aren't we paying teachers what they're worth? Like if that's, you know, part of the question,
Yeah.
you know, I think that we're really seeing it. Like I was down today on the picket line for the nurses, right? Walking that line because our nurses in Minnesota are on strike right now. And I think we're seeing this iterated through a lot of our workforce, especially the workforce that were our essential and frontline employees during the pandemic, right? Folks who, like we said, you're so valuable that we need you to keep going to work. And then now what are we doing for these so-called heroes that we're not providing the same support? So I think as far as educators in the state of Minnesota, there's been historical disinvestment at the state level in terms of how public schools are funded. And so it's hard for us to keep up with paying teachers what they deserve and need to be making because the state hasn't kept up with funding our school system in terms of our ability to provide mandated services that we're required to provide, in terms of keeping up with inflation. None of that is happening. So if you look at the numbers from the state, from the legislature, if you look at that with inflation, we're actually defunding schools year after year because we're not even keeping up with inflation in terms of our funding. So every year, Minneapolis public schools and other school districts, public school districts in the state are having to figure out how to work with less and less. Our kids' needs are more and more, you know?
No, for sure. I want to talk about safety in schools, particularly maybe gun safety. You know, I know it's a few schools, middle schools, they've been finding guns and stuff. If you are in that position, that's some of the stuff you're gonna be walking into. So I just want to know your thoughts with that. You know, as far as is there a plan with that, or suggested plan, or why is that happening? You would say.
I think that crime is caused by scarcity. And I think that when we have conditions that cause people to feel scarcity, we have increase in crime. And I think we've seen that clearly over the course of the last 3 years with the conditions created by the pandemic, the conditions created by George Floyd's murder, how that has affected, communities with kids not being in school, with the economy and everybody feeling squeezed financially. As far as addressing gun violence in schools or near schools, pertaining to schools, it is a really high priority concern. And I do happen to be a person who is not for putting law enforcement officers back in school. I want us to be able to find a different solution to address safety. Now, it has to be something. We have to have some sort of community safety initiative, but I think that we need to find a way to do that without having to partner with the Minneapolis Police Department. That's my opinion. I know it's not shared by everybody, but
Why would you say that though?
because I don't think that the Minneapolis Police Department is a good organization. I think that I don't think how I want to say this. I don't believe that that organization, the system that policing comes out of, can be reformed to be really serving individual citizens, because I think that the system itself is too corrupt. Now, I think there's individual officers who are really trying to fill that gap, to figure out how to be in partnership, but I think the system is making it really, really hard, if not impossible, for that real partnership to happen. And I love the idea of communities coming together to reimagine what we could be doing to keep each other safe without having to rely so much on the police department. And I think some of that work has started to happen, and I think that work needs to be invested in. I think it needs to be invested in for our school system. I think it needs to be invested in at the city level. I think it needs to be invested in at the county level.
What does that look like though? Like, does that so are the community members now policing, or what would that look like?
I'm not 100% sure what that would look like. But, like, let me throw an example at you that's not about necessarily gun violence, but something that I'm a really big fan of that's happening coming out of Hennepin County. So there's this new program out of Hennepin County, culturally responsive family stabilization services. Okay? So you can call this number, and right now they're open 10 to 10, okay? And they're hoping that they can make it a 24-hour, 24/7 service. If a youth in your household, 5 to 21, is having a mental health or a behavioral health crisis, you can call them and they will come to you within 1 hour, and they will provide 72 hours of community partnership stabilization services. And then you can be done. There's not referral to law enforcement. There's not referral to CPS. There's not referral to county systems involvement that might not be wanted or needed. Now, if a family wants more support, that opportunity exists, right? In fact, I think they're developing like an 8-week education program, but it's opt-in. So basically, if someone says, I need help in this moment, because this is a crisis, this is an emergency, this is a safety issue, are not opting in to having to now have the county involved in your household for the next 6 months, 12 months, years. If that's not what you want or what you need, you can get the services that you need to be safe in the moment, right? And it's an amazing program, and I think that we can create programs like that. So that's not just citizens, that's coming from the county, right? So I know that we can't have just individual people on the street be responsible for public safety in that way, right? Like, But I do think that we can imagine and conceive of something, create something, and implement something together if there's investment, financial investment, that can increase safety significantly, and that can come from us, from the ground, from the communities.
You talked a little bit about basically your being having a disability. You're more knowledgeable to help. But what's some of the things that you think are being overlooked as far as what they're not getting? What's some of those things?
Yeah, so I think that we have a really limited idea. And when I say we, I mean at a systems level, okay, because I personally know many educators who are pushing back against this. But as a system, as an educational system, we have a really narrow idea of how students learn, how students behave around learning, how students show their learning, their knowledge, their expertise, and their skill, right? The different modalities of what learning should look like. And I think that it leaves a lot of kids out. It leaves out a lot of kids who qualify for special education services. It leaves out a lot of kids who don't qualify or haven't been identified to qualify for special education services, but just have different ways of learning or being, right? These narrow standards and norms are based, they're super Eurocentric, they're based on whiteness, they're based on a non-disabled way of being, right? And so when we say this is sort of the acceptable behavioral expectations around learning, and I'm not talking about behavior like disruptive behavior, right? I'm talking about just like this is what we can observe, what learning looks like. And we have this really narrow idea of what learning looks like. And if any kids are learning in a different way, engaging in a different way, we say that's not all right. We try to push them into that narrow standard, right? Kids, that's not going to work for every kid. So there's this like analogy that's not my personal analogy, a different special educator who I really like uses it, that when you're bowling, if you just go down the middle, right, you're going to end up with a 7-10 split. And then it's going to be really hard to knock down those outside pins, right? But if you aim for the outside pins, those can knock over all the other pins, and that's how you can get a strike when you're bowling, right? So the idea is that if we aim for the outside pins with our kids, right, if we look at the students who need the most support, the students who are developing most differently from a typical kid, students like my 7-year-old who has really complex disabilities, looks very, very different from a non-disabled or typically developing kid, right? And you say, we need to have a way of teaching, right, of educating that he could fit into. You're going to get everybody else. If you plan for the kids who have the biggest needs or the most different needs, you can plan for everybody because you're aiming for the outside pins in that way.
Yeah.
And I think disabled people have to exist in a world that wasn't made for us. We're constantly having to innovate, create workarounds, do things differently in order just to survive, right? And there's lots of different ways that disability looks, so there's lots of different ways that innovation looks. We're really good at coming up with solutions when what somebody is presenting to us isn't going to work for us. How are we going to do it differently? And so that's like part of sort of the culture of disability and like our legacy that I would be so excited to bring, and I do it for myself and I had to do it for my child as well. So I think that we need to be a lot more expansive, right? I think our kids are so brilliant. Like, I've never met a child in my life, okay, 5-year-old, teenager, whatever. I've been a case manager, I've been a child care provider, like I've worked with a lot of kids, a lot of different kinds of kids, a lot of different ages. I've never met a child in my life that I didn't walk away from like, wow, that kid is brilliant. Like that kid knows something. That kid is skilled, right? That kid has limitless potential. But we are not making our kids feel that way in school, and we are not bringing that out of our kids and nurturing that in our kids the way that we need to for all of our kids. Some kids are getting it. All of our kids need to get that. So to me, that's part of the gift of being a disabled person and knowing how to look at what's not happening, what needs to be happening differently. Let's be really expansive. Let's be really creative. Let's be really innovative here.
So I just want to talk about the academic gaps a little bit.
Yeah.
I read some numbers. I don't know if they're the most updated numbers, but it says like 92% of Minneapolis public school black kids cannot do math at a grade level. At grade level.
That is accurate and current. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about like why. You know, what is that a result of in your opinion? I know you don't know for sure, but like, what can we do to change that, and why is that even happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that's racism. I mean, I would say that because when you also look at the data for our white kids, it's very different data. So this is, not just an issue of we're doing a bad job teaching our kids. We are specifically doing a bad job teaching our black kids, kids of color, indigenous students, right? So kids who receive English language learner services and kids who receive special education, all down at the bottom, right? So this isn't just like, there can't be another reason other than racism for why we're not teaching specifically students of color, and 8% on numeracy. I think it's 14% for black children with literacy. Okay, it's not equitable. So there's a lot of reasons that I can personally see for this. Something that's been really important to me is interrupting the overuse and the inequitable use of exclusionary discipline, right? Like, my child goes to a K-5 school in Minneapolis Public Schools that has a really high suspension rate for K-5 students. I don't know what K-5 students are doing where they need to be suspended from school because these are little children. But when we pulled the data on the numbers, we saw that black students were getting referred for exclusionary discipline and suspensions more than 2 times the rate of white students, which of course is not surprising. But how are those kids supposed to be keeping up with their academics when they're being removed disproportionately from their classrooms? That's where you have to be to learn, right? Okay, so that's one thing, right? And we see that iterated at every school, right? We know that this is a big problem, right? We know that not having enough educators of color is a big problem. We know that there's a relationship piece that comes with learning, and that having teachers that look like our students, that have similar life experiences to our students, that understand what our students are going through in terms of their identities, their cultural identities, their racial identities, helps kids learn. White students are getting that. I know last year when we were talking about this, when the teacher strike was happening, we had 5 white students for every 1 white teacher in Minneapolis Public Schools, 55 black students to every 1 black teacher in Minneapolis. How are they supposed to be getting the same opportunity around mirrored cultural experiences and race when they're not getting that same opportunity to learn from people who look like them? That's a disparity that has to be addressed, right? And then I think that overall, we need to have literacy and numeracy curriculum, frameworks, instructional practices that are efficacious, evidence-based, based in the science of how we know most children learn. So we're rolling out a new numeracy curriculum, a new math curriculum this year in Minneapolis. I'm hopeful about that. And we are starting to have some movement around rethinking the literacy frameworks that we've been using that have not been working. I think it's gonna be a few years of sorting through how are we going to teach literacy and how are we going to make sure all of our educators have access to the development that they need to be able to align with the frameworks that we're hoping to use in the district. But, that's a place to start. But another thing, transportation, right? Again, going back to what I was talking about with exclusionary discipline, right? If we don't have equitable and functional transportation, students can't get into those classrooms to learn. So I think there's an even like equitable access to be in the classroom. There's a relationship, cultural sustainability, and responsiveness issue where I would roll in having more educators of color. And then there's like the integrity of the instruction. So I think we have to sort of look at several different factors that are influencing those disparities and address them all.
You mentioned transportation. Is that do high schoolers? Do you know? Do high schoolers get transportation to school?
I think right now, if they live, I think it's I can't remember if it's 1 mile or 2 miles for high schoolers, and then I think they can access like a go-to pass to take the bus, right? So.
Is that normal?
And then it wasn't when I went to Minneapolis Public Schools. I had a school bus. All through high school, I had a school bus. So I don't know, in terms of speaking to sort of what's normal historically, I'm not exactly sure what the trajectory on transportation has been, and obviously the last couple of years have been so sort of disrupted in terms of how being in school, not being in school, you know. But I do know that it's a concern of a lot of families like who live on the north side, where there is a real safety concern about how far do I want my child to have to walk, right, to get to and from school, or even stand at a bus stop, right? So, and then middle schoolers, I think it's a mile that they have to walk before they would get a bus. And I know that at least some middle schoolers are getting a bus pass too at this point, like a city bus pass. So.
Are they old enough to ride the city bus?
I think so. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I do read parent forums, and I think I was reading in a parent forum this last week about how those passes are at least available to middle school students. I don't know if they're required or if it differs from site to site.
Well, I guess maybe they're middle school is like 14, 15.
Like
Oh,
12,
no, 12.
13.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
So I think we had to look at, now, again, just like with educators, there's a bus driver shortage. So I know that transportation is trying to do more with less, you know, like everybody right now. But it's an equity issue, you know. If it's impacting our kids' ability to safely get to school so they can be at school.
Would you say online learning through the pandemic, and even some still now, but would you say that helps, or is that an option? Do you think that's better?
I mean, I think it depends on the student, right? I know that some students did really well with online, and that's one of the reasons that Minneapolis opened up. They have an online Minneapolis public school. They have a whole school out of Minneapolis that's online now, like 100% that you can enroll in. Last I heard, they had a waiting list, but so for students where that was a really good fit for them, I think it's great that they've built it out as a long-term option. But for some students, it was terrible.
Yeah.
And there were access issues. It widened some of the opportunity gaps that our students deal with, right? So, you know, it's not a one size, like there's no one size fits all. And we can't think of online options as a one size fits all. If it's working great for a student, let's get them access. But if it's not going to work for a student, we can't throw them in an online program and forget about them. We need to figure out what works for that student.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how to address all of these. You know, if it's a shortage of bus drivers, you know, how do you? It's tough, but that's why you'll be in that position, not me. You know?
Yeah.
I want to talk about genders, like gender neutral, like bathrooms and that sort of thing. What's your position on that?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you know, but I'm transgender. So making sure that transgender kids have access to school, like all groups of kids need to have good access to school. I think gender neutral bathrooms are one way to potentially increase access. I think, you know, we again look site by site, school by school, community by community, and think about if we want to make sure that all students have equitable access to education, how do we address every group of students? And to me, that's a group of students that deserves access to education.
Is there an age group, or is it like, should that be in elementary schools, or should it be? on up, or how do you feel when it comes to that?
I think when kids, I think kids are exploring these questions about identity very young, okay? And I think that when kids are doing their identity exploration, we should always hope for every child that they have trustworthy adults who are providing guidance around that exploration, right? Whether that's, excuse me, whether that's exploration of their gender identity, whether that's exploration of their racial identity, whether that's exploration about, you know, a student who is receiving special education services or has a disability-based identity, you know, like helping our kids make sense of their thoughts, right? And their process is really important for their conceptualization of self. And so I don't know that there's a too young to talk about it. I think there's age appropriate and developmentally appropriate ways to talk about it. Like I would never talk about, you know, gender identity, transgender issues of sexuality with a little child the same way I would talk about it with a 17-year-old. It's a completely different conversation, right? So I don't know, I don't think that there's a too young to talk about it. I think that there's good evidence in existence about how to have the conversations in a healthy way with students kids, community members, whoever, at every sort of different age and developmental point, and you just do it in a really age appropriate way. But it's the same way as like, you know, like we have to talk to little kids about like potty training, right?
Yeah.
So like obviously we're having conversations with little kids about their bodies, but we're doing it in an age appropriate way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not in a way that could be harmful or inappropriate. I think we just iterate that.
So I mean, what would that look like briefly? What would you say, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to talk to the communities that are impacted. I believe that for everything, leadership of the most impacted is like one of my guiding stars. And I do think that we need to be talking to the youth, because I think that our cultural ideas are really evolving quickly around gender identity, and we need to have youth giving us an idea, because I'm 40. I'm not sure how old you are, but I'm old, right? So
29.
So, you know, I think I know what those conversations were like when I was in high school, but it's a whole, like I said, I have an 18-year-old. It's completely different now, right? And our youth are going to let us know what they need. So, but I absolutely affirm transgender and gender nonconforming youth. I want them to be safe. I want them to be healthy. Youth who are transgender and gender nonconforming are very vulnerable and targeted, right? So they are youth that need support. They need access to healthcare. They need access to mental health support services. You know, just like any of our vulnerable and targeted groups of students, right? They need equitable access, and that looks different from student to student and from group to group. So I'm really committed to equity across all of our student groups.
What about like transgender in sports, stuff like that?
Yeah, I think, you know, fortunately, there's a lot of people who have done, excuse me, a ton of research around what equity looks like for trans people in sports. But, you know, the reality is that, like, and I can't speak from a total place of expertise here, but I know a little bit, our human physiology is so variable, right? To say that, like, everyone who is assigned female at birth, who's born and assigned, you know, thought to be female, has the same physiology, the same ability, the same skill, and everyone who's assigned male at birth has the same physiology, the same ability, the same skill. That's just factually wrong, right? So we know there's a huge variety in terms of ability and skill. So, like, if the question is it fair, right, for a transgender person to be competing in sports, I think, you know, yes, it's fair. I believe it's fair. And the question of, what that fairness looks like is going to might depend on if that person is using gender affirming hormone therapy as a form of their health care, or if they're not. On a case by case basis, there might be some things to look at or to examine. But, it is a person who says that they are a boy or a man is a boy or a man, and a person that says they are a girl or a woman is a girl or a woman, and that has to be affirmed.
You don't believe there's any advantages?
I don't. And, I have not personally heard of a compelling case where there are, right? So I know when I take testosterone, right? So when I got on hormones, my muscle mass started to increase, right? Which means, I guess, I'm stronger muscularly than before I started taking testosterone, right? But, I mean, I'm not a competitor, right? Like, I wouldn't be concerned that it would be, that the healthcare that I'm receiving or my gender identity would give me an unfair advantage. I mean, look at me, you know what I mean? So, I think that when we think about is it unfair? Is there an unfair advantage? Is there an unfair disadvantage? I mean, we can look case by case, certainly, but I myself have never read anything that's compelling that that's actually the case, especially for people who are taking cross-gender hormones, who are using, hormone therapy as part of their health care for transgender people, because it does start to alter your physiology and your ability.
You said, so, okay, so if there's, and forgive me if I say something wrong.
No, it's cool.
So if there's somebody that was born male and wants to identify as a woman, they don't have any advantages over women in sports?
I mean, what about, you don't think that there's women, though, who are identified as female at birth, who identify as women, who are, you know what I mean? Who are really, really strong, like as strong as some men?
I mean, I think there's an exception. Like there's, you got the bodybuilders and, those. But I think in majority, no. Like on a basketball team, if there's 12 people on there, I would say majority no. Majority no.
So when I think about
as far as strength,
Right. But then think about things like agility. Think about like the cognitive processing that goes into playing a sport, right? When someone is very skilled at a sport, there's a lot of different elements that are going into why they're so skilled. Some people are just born with a God-given talent or strength or physical attribute that might give them an advantage, right? But we understand, we have our sports set up that some people have an advantage. Some people are better. Some people are stronger. Some people are taller, right? Basketball, some people are taller, but we wouldn't say, this is the basketball team for people over 6'5", here's the basketball team for under 6'5". We don't want this person who is 6'7" to play against this person who's 6'1", because that's an unfair advantage. We say it, you can build your skill, and there's some things that we can't control here, and it's fair.
Regulate it as best as we can.
Yeah.
I think it probably comes from movies and stuff. You got Joanna Man. Where
I have not seen it, I will say.
That was a professional basketball player who got kicked out of the NBA for whatever he got kicked out for. But so his only way of getting back to basketball, the game he loved, was to go to the WNBA. And he was just like killing them. Like he had to hold back. So I'm just saying stuff like when you watch movies like that, he like, dang, do they have an advantage? Depending on which way they want to go with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's good to be curious and be asking these questions about, because this is an equity issue, right? So I think that when we're sort of interrogating, like, is this fair? Is this fair for everybody? Is this equitable? Like, those are always good questions to be asking and to be curious about. And, admittedly limited research into transgender people in sports is just that I don't think that their equity is being compromised. I think that it just sort of rolls into that natural, like we were talking about with height, human variability where some people, might have an edge or not, but it's such a small, you know what I mean, in the grand scheme of things. It's a small advantage or disadvantage, and so we kind of have like a spectrum of ability that we sort of say, all right, this is an acceptable range of abilities for this sport, for this competition, for this team. And I think that transgender people most, if not all the time, fit into that acceptable range of ability where they're just fitting into the natural diversity of ability of the people in their sport or their team.
I think that was kind of a good point, though. There is advantages. Somebody's always quicker, somebody's taller, I hadn't thought about that. I don't know, I guess for the voters, if there's any last remarks you would like to leave with the voters, your message, what you pushing, how to find you.
I'm findable. I have a campaign website at www.sonya4mps.com. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. Under my campaigns, you can find me there. So you can get in touch with me through socials, or there's a contact form on my website. And as far as what I would want to leave folks with, I do some work with Hennepin County Juvenile Justice, and where they liaise with education, right? And I have heard over the last year from multiple justice system involved youth or their families that they're being better served in Hennepin County Juvenile Justice educationally than they're being served in Minneapolis public schools. And that, that makes me still and angry and makes me motivated to try to make change, because there is no reason when we have these children in school, right? We have our kids, they're with us, right? We have tremendous opportunity for impact, both in terms of their education, but also in terms of their life trajectory, right? There is no reason that our youth should have to get court system and justice system involved in order to access adequate education, right? So I have been looking for all of the systems that are feeding this, that are bringing our kids to this point, right? Like, for students who receive special education, okay, there's a lot of different placements that a student who receives special education can get. Some kids who receive special education spend most of their time in a regular classroom, right? Some kids who receive special education spend most or all of their day in what they call a self-contained classroom, the segregated placement, okay? So when we asked the Minnesota Department of Education, me and some community organizers I work with, for data disaggregated by race for Minneapolis public schools about what kids are mostly in general education classrooms while they receive their special education services, and what kids are in segregated settings away from the community, right? We see Black children represented more than 2 times the average in those segregated settings. Now, this is a thing, these are settings that are focused on behavior compliance by and large. They're hyper-surveilled settings, and we have kids as young as 3 years old, right, who are being funneled into these settings. Now, my child is white, but he was also funneled into one of these segregated settings. And when we think about that messaging for those students, for their families, okay, that your child doesn't belong in community with other learners, right? There's a different place over here for your child. And we are telling children, helping them build a self-concept about being othered, about being away, about needing to be removed from community, right? And we see the data about what students that is happening to in Minneapolis, right? When we talk about over-identification of students of color for special education, this is what I think about. I think about not just over-identification for services.
Can you explain that? Over-identification.
Yeah, right. So there is a narrative that students of color, particularly black students, are being identified as needing special education services in school when they don't need those services, right? And so that would be over-identification, right? We're identifying too many kids. And I think that there's some stuff to untangle there, because on the one hand, you know, as a parent who's fought for my kid to get the services that he does need, I know that sometimes students are being under-identified or underserved. They're not getting all of the services and supports that they need. But clearly, based on the data, okay, based on the percentage breakdown, black students are being over-identified for being put in these self-contained, segregated settings. And to me, that is setting up, and okay, not just to me, based on evidence, once you put a young child into that setting, they don't come out of it. They don't come out of it in school, and they don't come out of it as adults. Most kids who end up in that setting educationally are either incarcerated or they end up in an institutional setting like group housing or something like that, right? Because if you're not raising kids in community, how do you think that they are going to be in community as adults, right? If you are not allowing, and think about what we're teaching other kids. Think about what we're teaching kids who aren't disabled about students with disabilities, people with disabilities. You're teaching those kids, these kids don't belong with us, right? They don't belong with us. Well, there is clear data that says that if you include children with significant disabilities in a general education classroom, all the kids do better. All the kids do better. There's sort of this myth that if you put a student with significant disabilities into a general education classroom, it'll be a distraction, right? And other kids will suffer. They won't get their education. If you actually set up supportive services, okay, and you make sure those educators are developed and everyone is supported, actually all the kids do better. That's what the data has found. So I think that we really need to be taking a look at what are we teaching our kids about themselves? That's just one example, right? But like when you spoke about the racial disparities in academics before, right? Like these systems were created this way on purpose. This is not some accident or some like whoopsie, you know, like these systems were created to oppress certain groups of people starting when they're young kids. And if we are not actively interrupting it, if we are not actively pushing back against it, dismantling it, seeing where it's happening and stopping it and creating something else, right? It will keep happening. And these are our kids, right? And so I guess that would be the biggest thing that I would want voters to know about me, is that the stakeholder group that I am most committed to is our students. I believe all of our kids have potential. I believe all of our kids deserve access to a fantastic education and good relationships with their educators and their school staff and administrators. I don't think there is one student that our district would be better off without. We need every single one of them. And we need to be giving every single one of them the education that they deserve. And that's what's most important to me as a school board candidate.
I don't know if when is election day?
November 8th.
November 8th?
November 8th. Early voting starts September 23rd. So there's lots of ways to vote. You can get a ballot mailed to you at your house and send it back in the mail. You can vote early. You can vote on the day of the election. So there's lots of different ways to vote. We'll be putting together a voter guide, and I'll be posting it on socials and on my website to help folks have access to information about all the different ways that they can vote. But everyone should vote.
Make sure you send it to us so we can share.
I
and push it and
will
push it.
send it to you.
But there you have it on Address It from Sonya.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor to speak with you tonight.
Glad you could make it. Thank you
too.
for coming.
Yeah.